Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tax Talk, broadcast by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. My name is Jordan Bateman. I'm the BC Director of the CTF, joined today by our fantastic Alberta Director, Paige McPherson.
Thanks, Jordan, and this is exciting. It's our first time trying out this new format, so I hope that people are joining us.
Yes, otherwise we'll just be talking to ourselves. It'll be great. And Christine Van Dyne, our Ontario Director, is with us as well. She's going to talk about a big story that she broke earlier this month, and also hang around and just chime in whenever she feels fit. So I want to say, first of all, thanks for joining us here live on Blab for Tax Talk. It's a new format we're learning, so we're still working the bugs out, so please be patient with us. My understanding is you can, you can actually leave comments in the bottom right-hand corner of your box that send a message. If you'd like to ask us a question, you can actually type in /Q, and it'll pop up for us as a question that we'll answer with that. So yeah, we're going to be joined, CBG is going to talk about Ontario government handing out millions of dollars to unions to do the one thing that they collect union dues for, which is negotiating. And Todd McKay, our Prairie Director, is going to stop by as well. He's got some big news on liquor in Saskatchewan. And also he did a debt clock tour, which is always good for a few funny stories. So yeah, lots of ways to keep track of us. You can follow us on Twitter. All of our handles are up there. And we'll just kind of get rolling. Just so you know, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization dedicated to only three things: lower taxes, less waste, and more government accountability. So that really frames all of the work we do across the country. There are directors like the three of us in every province, virtually every province across the country. We have an Atlantic office. We have an Ontario federal office as well. And over the next few weeks, you'll be meeting more and more of our directors and hearing from them and the work they do. Make sure you visit our website, taxpayer.com, and you can see what we've been working on. So yeah, let's open it up. Paige, what's new?
So we're going to be talking about a cool story out of Saskatchewan soon, a little liquor freedom, which, you know, is always good. So I wanted to start us off with something a little more depressing on the liquor front, I guess, what's happening here in Alberta. Tough times here in Alberta lately. You know, we're getting a lot of tax increases and increased regulation, and really, unfortunately, craft beer doesn't escape that. So what's happened here is that Alberta used to have a small brewer's rate, which would apply to, you know, those unique little craft breweries that people like to try, the artisan beers. And now the government has put in place a policy where that small brewer's rate, which basically makes it affordable for those brewers, those little guys, to sell in the province, only applies to the local guys. So it only applies to people in Alberta, which means that, you know, the interesting kind of craft breweries across Canada, you've got Yukon Brewery, or let's say Steam Whistle in Toronto, or in other countries, Innocent Gun in Scotland. They are now not part of this small brewer's rate, which makes it more expensive for them to function here. And we're starting to see the blowback of this policy already. In fact, one of these breweries has actually pulled out of the province altogether. So Muskoka Brewery in Ontario, unfortunately for anybody here in Alberta that enjoys drinking Muskoka beers, is pulling out of Alberta altogether. And actually it applies to Saskatchewan and to where you are in BC as well, Jordan, because of the New West partnership, you guys are kind of exempt. So that means that your beers are still going to be cheap, the craft beers in Alberta, but that Muskoka Brewery is pulling out of BC and Saskatchewan too. So in all three of our provinces, we're not going to be able to have those beers, which really shows that these horrible government protectionist measures of hiking taxes on people outside of your local jurisdiction really just nails consumers. We get less selection and choice. We get higher prices because of this beer. And it kind of sucks for those people who enjoy craft beers here in Alberta.
Yeah, it's kind of unfathomable too, because liquor policy in Canada seems to be going the other direction. We're getting slow steps in BC and in Saskatchewan towards more open markets, trying to get government out of the business altogether, which should be the end goal. But here Alberta is going backwards. Is the 1970s really that exciting for them?
Well, exactly. And you know what? So something called the Alberta Small Brewers Association, a group of a few of these local breweries, has been lobbying for this for some time. So the majority of the members of the Alberta Small Brewers Association were lobbying for this back in 2013. The government didn't take them up on it at this time. And now, you know, the new NDP government, I suppose, has taken them up on this policy. And ironically, when it came through, was sort of marketed as something that was good for craft beer in Alberta. And I mean, it does sort of in a weird way, give the local guys a bit of an edge in that, it squeezes out their competitors. But of course, the sensible thing to do would be just, if you want to help out the local guys, lower taxes on the local guys, or lower taxes across the board, make it easier for everybody to compete. But unfortunately, I'm sure Muskoka Brewery is not going to be the last one to pull out of the province because of this ridiculous policy.
Yeah, what really the NDP are saying in Alberta is their craft beer market in Alberta, the craft beer makers in Alberta are so fragile, so poor at what they do that they can't stand up to competition from other parts of the country.
Exactly, which is so silly because Alberta has some really great craft beers. Here in Calgary, there's some really great breweries. I mean, these guys do well on their own, but essentially their argument was and has been for several years that you've got terrible regulations and legislation about this in other provinces. And so we need to kind of catch up to that terrible level because it's more difficult for them to enter those markets in other provinces. We need to kind of be crappy for the other guys outside of our province as well, or outside of our region as well, which is kind of like saying, well, New Brunswick has a high sales tax, so we should have a high sales tax too, which I don't think would fly for people. But yeah, I mean, this policy, like I said, right off the bat was marketed in a kind of positive way by a few people. But I think now that people are seeing that Muskoka Brewery is pulling out of the region altogether, which actually made national news when it happened, I think people will realize that these kind of silly protectionist measures are just not the way to go.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy. Of course, CBG and I live in the world of public liquor stores. Hey, Ontario, you can't get liquor after 9 p.m. Is that right? Am I wrong on that?
No, you're absolutely right. And with Kathleen Wynne, our premier, has just announced that she's going to be liberalizing the beer store sales, and beer is going to be available in some grocery stores in Ontario. And for all of the hoopla she's doing around it, you'd think she'd invented the idea of retail sales of beer. I mean, it's not rocket science to put beer on grocery store shelves, but somehow this government's managed to make it incredibly complicated and convoluted.
But it's just in some liquor stores or in some grocery stores.
Some grocery stores, and conveniently, it's not in the one that I shop at. So they only chose the socially responsible grocery stores. So I'm not quite sure what that means, but I'm sure our social justice premier here knows what she's doing.
Yeah, well, that'll be the ones that give the biggest donations to the Ontario Liberal Party.
Exactly.
All right, well, my story is a bit of a weird one, and it's has Seinfeldian origins. So there's a group that's going around to municipal councils here in British Columbia trying to convince them that it would be a great idea if cities supported a federal government tax credit. So cities not putting their money on the line. Instead, the federal government putting their money on the line to give tax credits to businesses that hand out leftovers to the homeless. Which, in a way sounds good, right? Like you don't want food to go to waste, and if people can use it, why shouldn't they? The problem is the anti-poverty groups hate this idea because essentially you're giving garbage, that's their word, not mine, to the poor. And it reminds me of that great Seinfeld episode where Elaine runs into Mr. Lippman, her old boss, and convinces him to start the muffin top coffee shop where they only sell the muffin tops, and they pop the top and they throw the stumps in a bag and they drop the bag off at the homeless shelter. And of course, it's a great episode. And the lady, of course, at the homeless shelter is just absolutely incensed by this. We've never had so many complaints. The homeless people just keep asking, where are the tops? Where are the tops? It's that kind of craziness, right? The food banks here are not prepared to take in a bunch of quickly perishable food. I mean, if it's reaching the end of its shelf life, or you've got to get rid of it quickly and hand it off to someone who needs it. You're talking about if you had a tax credit, you could actually swarm these food banks with food that has to be turned over quickly. None of them are prepared for that. You're going to talk about more money probably in tax funding subsidies to get them up and running. So the whole thing is just one of those ideas that you wonder what a municipal politician is thinking. Besides, let's get these guys out the door and on to the next council and away from us.
So they're talking specifically about giving it to the homeless shelters or to the food banks in particular?
Well, that's the thing. They don't really know where they want to give this food to. The food banks, I guess, would be the logical one, but they're not set up for it.
Yeah.
For me, I see a real difference in the world between customers, and taxpayers. And as consumers, I'm more than happy to go to local businesses and push them to, make sure that they're handing off food or leftovers to people who need it. That's our job as consumers. And in fact, if you remember, hotels in the last 10 years have all of a sudden all popped up with those little cards that say, please, can you reuse your towels, reuse your sheets, you save money and energy and all those things. That was all consumer driven. And it's not because the federal government, suddenly launched a tax credit. It made economic sense for hotels, and then it spread like wildfire because consumers started demanding it. That's what should happen here is we as consumers can demand these things, but we as taxpayers shouldn't be shelling out tax dollars to pay for it.
Yeah, it sounds like a classic case of, it's a good idea in that it's a laudable goal. They have the right intentions in mind. But somehow when governments or politicians try to plan things, which they always love to do, something along the way goes wrong and it just doesn't make sense. And so often, they're not working with those people who are actually working on the ground, like the people who are working in homeless shelters or in food banks that just can't deal with that kind of perishable food. So yeah, that's interesting, but I like the Seinfeld connection.
Yeah. There's a bakery here in where I live called Cobb's Bakery, and they give out, once every day, a local church comes, different churches every day, and they pick up, bread that's they can't sell anymore or they won't sell anymore. Those churches then distribute that bread through their independent networks. Yep. That makes sense to me, right? Cobb's isn't getting any tax break out of it. They get good press. They get the feeling that they're doing something right. I, as a customer, feel like, I'm supporting something that's worthwhile, but they don't need a tax break to do it. And I think that's where we really start to fall down here is this idea that we have to, as government, reward good behavior with tax breaks rather than using public pressure or customer pressure to make it happen.
Mm-hmm. Or just, people are good people, right? I mean, you see people buying lunch for homeless people all the time on the streets. I mean, people start these kinds of foundations like to help homeless people out of their goodness of their hearts. I mean, that's a real thing. The people don't have to be driven by government incentives in order to do the right thing. And church groups, organizing and doing that kind of stuff is the perfect example of that. Also, when I lived in Vancouver, I loved Cobb's. That is the best bakery. And I recently found one it's kind of in the suburbs of Calgary, but it was a good day for me when I found that bakery.
Nice. And I see at V3LDJ, you're exactly right. It's something food banks should do on their own. And frankly, some of them do it on their own. And they do it in manageable ways that they can make sure, Luke, that they can handle it. So CVG, you did some FOIing.
Yeah. So yesterday I just put out a news release that we had obtained documents through Freedom of Information Act showing exactly what it cost for the Ontario government to put these temporary markers up to create high occupancy vehicle lanes during the Pan Am Games. Now, for those of you who are not living in the Greater Toronto Area, during the Pan Am Games, the province wanted to encourage people to carpool into the games to reduce traffic. So they made these high occupancy vehicle lanes. Instead of making commuting easier, obviously, it really added hours and hours to people's commutes, like up to 3 hours added to people's commutes in the morning if they left at rush hour. And you would see, lanes and lanes of blocked traffic, people stuck waiting for hours trying to get to their jobs, and these empty HOV lanes sitting right beside them. And if you drove in them and you didn't have two other people in your car, so a total of 3 people in your car for your commute to work in the morning, you would get a ticket. I was curious about what it cost to paint these markers onto the road and then remove that paint. So CTF did a Freedom of Information request, and we learned that the cost was $3.2 million to paint this stuff onto the road and then take it away only a few weeks later. And now the Premier is saying, we might do it all over again because these HOV lanes were such a resounding success. By success, I think she means inconvenience. And so she might want to put these markers down all over again. So I don't really know how many times she expects the taxpayers in this province to pay for her multi-million-dollar paint jobs. But once was definitely one time too many. People don't like these lanes. They're inconvenient. They actually, the rate of accidents went up during the time when those HOV lanes were in place, because people were frustrated. I mean, you make reckless moves when you're driving, when you're sitting in traffic for 3 hours trying to get to your job, you start doing dangerous things, and accident rates went up. So we think that the Premier really should not put this paint down again that we already paid a few times for. It's a classic example of the government paying someone to dig a hole and then fill it in. It's just pure waste. So it's quite an interesting story. I was frankly shocked to see how much exactly it cost.
So I have a question about where the money came from. I mean, it sounds so ridiculous, and here in Alberta they're talking about that kind of stuff too. HOV lanes and talking about congestion pricing and that kind of stuff. What did it come out of the games budget? Was it part of that kind of funding?
No, so this was ministerial money. So this came out of the Ministry of Transportation. The Pan Am Games had a budget of $2.5 billion. So the Ministry of Transportation, on top of that, had a $61 million budget for transportation. This was a part of that $61 million. I don't know where the rest of the money went. I'm sure they found unique and interesting ways to waste it in this province, as they always do. But yeah, this was not even a part of the Pan Am budget. It was transportation money.
Which makes it even worse because, I have a lot of friends that live in Ontario who were kind of outraged by the amount of money that was spent on these games as it is. So now you see that, the amount that they allocated it and would have been reported is not even the full amount of what it cost Ontarians for those games just in Toronto.
Yeah, so the thing is, the Premier's pet project in Ontario is she wants to spend $130 billion on infrastructure over the next 10 years. So a tremendous amount of money to spend on infrastructure, which obviously a lot of that money is going to come through the transportation budget. And then we see how the transportation ministry is using the money. They're using it to paint signs on the roads and then unpaint it only a few weeks later. So if you need to spend $130 billion to do that kind of thing, I think you've got your priorities a bit wrong. We need roads and bridges. We don't need paint and then paint remover.
So how, in judging by how people have responded to this Freedom of Information request, which is just pretty hilarious, awful. It's outraging, but it's also funny. The HOV lanes in general, and I'm interested in this because, as I said, this is something that's been going on in Alberta in sort of a sidebar discussion kind of a way, linked in with carbon taxing, is this idea of congestion pricing and HOV lanes being that. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that went over? Just the lanes themselves, aside from the fact that you said accidents increased, but how did people react to this in general?
Well, people don't like spending 3 hours commuting to work, I can tell you that. The lanes were really unpopular. The idea of making them permanent is even more unpopular. The idea of putting a toll on these lanes is incredibly unpopular. We do have a traffic problem in the Greater Toronto area. The traffic congestion here is very bad. The thing is, as a broad principle, a lot of people understand why you would want to put a toll on a road. You could reduce other kinds of taxes for infrastructure spending and build roads as a result of putting tolls on the roads. It can work as a good idea. The problem is this is infrastructure that we've already built, we've already paid for through our taxes, we already pay through the incredibly high gas taxes that we pay as federal and Ontario provincial taxes. So really what the Premier is trying to do is just squeeze more money out of the people of Ontario by putting a dollar price on things that we've already paid for once. So we paid for these roads once. We really don't need to pay for them twice. What the Premier needs to do is get her other budget spending under control, public sector wages, in order to build better infrastructure in this province. That's the real solution. The solution isn't asking taxpayers to pay twice for something like roads.
I think what people don't realize too, politicians don't seem to realize, is that driving is not a luxury. Driving your kids to daycare or getting to work in the morning is not this, carbon tax treated as kind of a sin tax, or these kinds of congestion taxes like a sin tax. It's not a sin to have to drive to work, it's treated almost in the same way as alcohol or cigarettes, which, are also sort of silly, but this is a necessity of life for so many people. Not everybody lives, walking distance from their work in a condo or something like that. So, it's almost as if politicians can't wrap their head around that, and they're in the segment, I guess, that probably drive to work but can afford it. And so, our friend Luke over here makes a great point as well, that these kind of things punish the poor, because lower income people need to get to work and get their kids to daycare too. And it's not a luxury, it's a necessity.
And in Ontario, you're left with really there are few other alternatives of how you're going to get to work. You drive, because the public transit here is almost non-existent in a lot of areas of Toronto. So to force people to pay so much to get to work every morning is really, it's a shame. And the Premier is really out of touch if she's going to try and squeeze money out of these commuters.
Yeah, and we're talking about road pricing here in British Columbia. The problem is British Columbia has 50 cent a litre gas taxes, and there's no discussion. It's always about creating more revenue, not actually reducing it, reducing the tax burden on people. So, why there isn't this kind of corresponding drop. And I have a real, like you, CBG, a real philosophical problem paying for infrastructure that's already been paid for through taxes. It's one thing to toll a new bridge or a new tunnel that, wouldn't have been done without the toll. But to tax things that have already been paid for is ridiculous.
Todd has joined us.
Hi, Todd.
Yeah.
Our friend Todd, the Prairie Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, is here with us. He's got some stories, more uplifting liquor stories than I had, for sure. How you doing, Todd?
I'm doing great. Thanks for including me in this conversation, guys.
Of course.
Todd, tell us the good news about liquor.
Well, we just got a great announcement from the Saskatchewan government. Look, we've been trying to undo prohibition-era laws here in Saskatchewan for 20 years. The taxpayers have been fighting this fight, basically saying the government has a responsibility to keep us safe and pave the roads. It's not really good at selling booze. Get out of the booze business already. For a long time, that conversation has really been a privatization conversation here. And ultimately, that was really a red herring in many ways, because there's 450 off sales in Saskatchewan that sell beer and spirits and wine in small towns and in different communities. But they've been forced to pay higher prices when they're buying their stock from the government. And they've been forced to endure stupid rules like, some vendors have been forced to sell warm beer. Look, I'm not a retail expert.
That's a tragedy.
But exactly. If you're selling beer and you're selling it warm, you're doing it wrong. That's the reality of the situation. And for the government to have rules that force that to happen is, of course, just ridiculous. So what the Saskatchewan government recently did was really outstanding. What they did is just brought in basic fairness. So anybody who's a liquor retailer in Saskatchewan will now buy their stock at the same price. That's government stores, that's off sales, that's everybody. So what we'll have is real competition. And secondly, all of those stupid rules, like forcing some vendors to sell warm beer, they're gone. Restrictions on hours that are enforced differently, gone. So what we've got is a level playing field. What does a level playing field mean? Well, it means that if you're picking up a bottle of wine or a six-pack of beer on the way home from work, or let's say you forget, you need to pick it up at halftime for the big game in the evening, you're not going to face different prices or different availability. You can pick the place that works best for you. And when that happens, when consumers get to choose, they always win. And so we're really excited to see this change announced.
That's great. I remember when I moved to Alberta and I was in a liquor store. First place I went. No, just kidding. I was in a liquor store and I got to the checkout and I'm thinking in my head, I was going to make gin and tonics. I was going to have some people over make gin and tonics. And thinking like, okay, where would I get tonic? Like, where's the closest grocery store? Thinking about these things. I get to the checkout and there's a cooler there and it has all these different kinds of mix for drinks. So, I mean, there are, cold beer and there's also chilled wine and all that kind of stuff, but there's also like all different kinds of pop. And I was just blown away that this is a thing. I'm like, oh my gosh, you have tonic right here. It's right here. And the guy at the cash is looking at me like I'm totally insane. I'm not be excited about this. But I'm saying, no, I'm coming from Ontario. This is a huge deal. It really just that thing. I didn't have a car at the time either. So, I mean, that's a bit of a schlep. It makes a difference in people's lives to just have that level of convenience. Like, it's kind of an awesome thing. So it's great that, you're going to have a higher level of convenience in Saskatchewan.
Well, I'm so glad that you survived the purchase of some tonic at a liquor store without government protecting you. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, what could have gone wrong? No, of course. This is reality, right? And it's one of those things. Look, are liquor policies the biggest deal in the world? No, they're not. There are many other bigger issues in the world. But what I think is a really big victory here is that we're giving Saskatchewanians a very clear message that you don't need government's help in order to buy a beer or sell a beer. I would like to take that a little further and say maybe you don't need the government's help to buy car insurance. Maybe you don't need the government's help to buy a cell phone. But whatever. Let's take her one step at a time. They've done an extraordinary job here. And really what this goes from, we used to have a joke in Saskatchewan, whenever you give directions, always give directions from the liquor store because A, everybody knows where it is, and B, there aren't very many of them, so it'll be easy enough to figure it out. Look, that's changing. That's going to change. It means that this change means that every single off sale, there's about 450 in the province, every single rural vendor, there's about 190 of them, will now be able to operate as full-line liquor stores and give the same service as government stores or some of the new private stores. And so what that means is we've gone from really a few hundred full-line, not even, about 100 full-line liquor stores. We're going to go to somewhere in the neighborhood of about 600 or 700. That's a real change that makes a big difference. And it also creates an opportunity for small businesses. There's a lot of small businesses, especially in rural communities, where they've been trying to make a go of it, selling a 6-pack of beer here and there. And they've been hampered by the government, giving them stupid rules, like forcing them to charge inflated prices or sell warm beer or whatever. Let's get that stuff out of the way. That's going to create some jobs, and it's going to be great.
Todd, you got to start showing up at all these liquor store openings with a ribbon and scissors and cut ribbons on every single private liquor store that opens in Saskatchewan.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it is. It's going to make a difference on just people's day-to-day life. And again, like I said, there are bigger issues than liquor regs for sure. But it's nice to make a difference in somebody's day-to-day life. And when you're in a hurry and you're on your way home, you're going out to a friend's place, you need to buy a bottle of wine or something, and you don't want to make an extra stop, this is going to make things a lot better.
All right, I got to ask. Now, Saskatchewan has that arcane rule where if you go see the Peelers at the strip club, you can't have a beer. Has that been changed? Asking for a friend, yes. Of course, asking for a friend.
Yeah, I've only read about these regs.
Yes,
obviously. Yeah. Look, it's that regulation did change, and then it changed back again, and then kind of changed again. So it's long been the rule in Saskatchewan that you can't sell alcohol if strippers are present. They've managed to get around any kind of challenges under freedom of expression, because being able to express yourself with booze present is not a human right. I suppose that makes some sense, despite how the policy may or may not make sense. But it actually came up a few years ago. There was a breast cancer fundraiser, and they brought in male strippers, and certain segments of the population were quite excited about this. And but that raised the issue. And the government looked silly on the whole thing, so they changed it to allow strippers generally. A few months ago, the premier changed his mind, decided strippers would no longer be allowed after all, and then a few days later sent the SLGA, the Liquor and Gaming Minister, out to say that strippers would not be allowed unless it's a charity event. So you can have strippers and alcohol in Saskatchewan, but only if it's for charity.
Oh, funny. There are all these laws. They remind me of the weird laws that some U.S. states have, where it's like you can't walk your horse through the main street on a Sunday or something like that. Like, it's this weird prohibitionist hangover of laws that just seems so strange of an area to legislate today.
That's right, and I think the stripper thing aside, again, it's a minor issue overall, but I think it does show a bigger issue in the sense that when we try to fix regulations by putting more regulations on, generally that doesn't work very good. Whenever we're making changes, we should try to change it in the direction of giving people more choice and more opportunities to decide what's right for them and in their lives. And this is a really good example. And on the stripper thing, I would argue the Saskatchewan government kind of went backwards or maybe round and round on. But on the liquor announcement they made the other day, it's a huge step forward, because after about 100 years of making little tinkering changes that added one complexity on top of another one, in this case, it's not a perfect policy they're bringing down. But what it is it gets an awful lot of the problems out of the way. So it makes things better right now. But secondly, it also sets the stage for better and bigger changes down the road. And so that makes it a big step forward. Anytime you're getting government out of the way, you're moving forward. Even when good changes are made but make things more complex, generally it's at best a couple steps forward and one step back.
Yeah. Hey, congratulations too, Todd, because I know this is something you've worked on for since you joined up, and it's been something the CTF has worked on for a long time, and something the Prairie directors, obviously near and dear to our heart, beer in Saskatchewan. So congratulations to you, and I hope you took a victory lap.
Definitely.
Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, it was fun. It was fun to be at the announcement. It was fun to see the minister make such a great announcement. But I got to say, I mean, honestly, I just showed up at the 1 yard line. There's been people who have been grinding away a long time at the CTF and other places to make this change. I happen to be at the right place at the right time, but it's great to see the government do this. And honestly, our supporters have been pushing for this for literally decades. And a lot of them, they're happy, but one of the predominant reactions is like, well, about time. So it's good to see it finally happen.
Hey, don't discount getting in at the 1 yard line. Ask the Seattle Seahawks. They had troubles. Christine,
yeah, we stayed on the ground game here.
Yeah, that's right. Just keep doing what you're doing. Christine, we wanted to talk about the union handout from government. Millions of dollars. Your press releases have been hilarious because they started at like $1 million, and then it was 2.5, and 3.5, and I think it's 7 now. Run us through what's going on.
Yeah,
what the heck is Ontario
maybe
doing?
we have a different definition of what's hilarious, Jordan, because I really, I guess it's fun. It would be funny if it wasn't so upsetting. But yeah, the Ontario government has given now. I think it's about $3.75 million to Ontario teachers unions, just to the unions, not for increasing salaries for teachers, not for resources for students, money directly to the unions. And they say that this money is to offset the bargaining costs that these unions incurred during the collective bargaining negotiation process. Now, what's odd is that unions collect dues. You, as a union member, you pay your union, a part of your paycheck every month. And that money that you're paying them is supposed to go towards the raison d'etre for unions, which is collective bargaining. Now, somehow these unions have convinced the Ontario government to cover that cost for them, even though in Ontario, the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation has a $65 million reserve fund. But nevertheless, even though they have $65 million, which is supposed to go towards paying for collective bargaining, the Ontario government paid OSSTF $1 million as part of the collective agreement this year to pay for what they called pizza and boardrooms, because, the salaries of the people doing the negotiations was already being covered by the government. So people are obviously a bit upset because pizza and boardrooms doesn't cost $1 million. We ran the numbers and it ends up being, like 50,000 pizzas and at a boardroom cost of $500 of boardroom a day. It's like, I don't know, like a year's worth of boardrooms or something like that. So, there's no accounting for where that money actually went. And the truth of the matter is because it's not to cover expenses. It's a sweetener to help the unions close a deal that they don't want to close because they want higher wage hikes for the teachers, who are already some of the highest paid in the country. I think second only to those in Alberta. So it's really a strange tactic in a labor negotiations. And if you talk to any labor lawyer or any labor market expert, they'll say management would never, ever pay for the union side of the bargaining process, because it creates, it's not just about wasting money, it's about the incentives around that money. If you do not bear any of the risks of refusing to settle, if you don't bear any financial consequence of digging your heels in, of drawing out the negotiating process, then why wouldn't you, throw up roadblocks in order to draw out the process and get a better deal? Of course you would do that. It's an incentive. You're incentivized to do it. So, the government created a whole bizarre set of incentives for these unions. Shockingly, the unions refused to settle for a long period of time. They engaged in work to rule strike action, and taxpayers were on the hook for this year. It was $2.5 million just this year for a bunch of the teachers unions to settle, money just going to the union. So it's a real shame. People here are really incensed about it, including if you talk to teachers, a lot of them are really angry about it too, because that money goes to the union leadership. It doesn't go to the members.
I actually filed a Freedom of Information request in BC with the Ministry of Labour to find out if we were doing the same thing. And it may have been the fastest response I've ever received on an FOI request. The ministry actually called me directly and said, never have, never will, no documents. And so it just shows you just how obscene this is to people who negotiate these kind of contracts full time.
It would never, ever happen in private sector negotiations. It doesn't happen in public sector negotiations, as you learned in British Columbia. It's a really bizarre kind of payment. And, a lot of people were really confused about why this payment was made by the Ontario Liberal government to these unions. Well, it's a little less confusing when you look at who supports this government during election campaigns. Other Freedom of Information requests showed that these unions who got these payments, so two of the unions who got the payments, and then one public sector education workers union, not teachers, but the administrators and custodians, those four unions have paid $800,000 over the past 3 years to the Liberal Party, and over the last 3 elections have spent $6.5 million on advertising campaigns attacking the opponents of the government. So, you might scratch your head and say, why would the government give these people money? Well, it's not that confusing when you look and see where the money is, where these unions choose to spend the money that they have in the $65 million reserve fund that now has just, received this year $2.5 million more. I mean, they're going to be able to run quite a great ad campaign in the next election in support of this government.
Yeah. So when you talk about those ad campaigns, are you talking about the ones that, during the Ontario election were all over Union Station, the big subway and GO train via rail station in Toronto? Those ones with the...
I'm talking about the working family, families ads. So these unions give $6.5 million to union working families.
Right. And I mean, it was, you can imagine, like Union Station, probably the biggest transit station in Canada, big, huge point for commuters. I mean, the walls were, because I was in Toronto when this was happening, the walls were like plastered everywhere with these massive ads. You can just imagine how expensive that would be in that location. But obviously it was, that important to those unions to spend that money on those massive ads. I mean, obviously they had a vested interest, and, here it is.
Yeah, it really seems like quid pro quo. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You run a campaign undermining the opposition parties in Ontario, and the government will give you $2.5 million this year. I mean, it's really cynical politics at its worst in Ontario. People are really angry.
Mm-hmm.
The Auditor General going to look into this? I know you called on the AG to get involved. Is it plausible?
Yeah, so CTF, we put out a news release asking the Auditor General to investigate. A few days after our call, some of the opposition parties put out the same request, and the Auditor General has now said she will do an investigation, which we think is great news. We're always happy when there's some third-party investigation. But it's going to be in her annual report. The AG does have authority to do a special report, which is what we asked for, but she's going to put this into her annual report, which won't come out until I think this spring.
Good feedback, though. Either way, like it's good that the issue is picked up. I feel bad for Ontario students. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like Ontario teachers at one level or another are on strike at all times. Like there's always news about Ontario teachers of some kind or another going on strike.
Yeah, and the CUPE members, the administrators and the custodians are still in some areas on work to rule. In some areas refusing to keep the doors locked in schools, which is, that's a safety concern. And in some schools, they are refusing to do after school care for students. So elementary students who have parents who work, their parents either have to leave early or have pay someone to go and pick up their child, because you can't leave an elementary age child unattended.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah, geez. Well, keep on it. I mean, this is something that we certainly want to see confined to Ontario and eliminated there, not spreading across the country. In British Columbia, the teachers, the most militant union in the public sector, settled on a 6-year deal thanks to a provincial government that, stuck it out through a strike for 2 weeks in the pre-summer, and then 6 weeks all the way to Thanksgiving in the fall.
Well, it is possible.
It is possible, and they got a good deal, and one that saved taxpayers a bunch of money. Teachers eventually felt the pressure to settle, but of course, if your union heads are getting money from the government, there is no pressure to bear.
So in Jordan, in British Columbia, didn't they actually follow through on cutting wages for teachers who were striking?
Yeah, so what they did is they actually reduced the wages of teachers when they were on work to rule, because they were only working part of their job. And then when they went out on strike, they took all those savings, put it together, and essentially gave rebates to parents to help them with daycare costs while the teachers were out on strike. Brilliant idea, not the least of all because it was the CTF who suggested it. What they did is, I got a check for the 2 kids who were in school at the time. And it did help cover our daycare costs, and it kept parents in the boat. And, the Teachers Federation had asked for such outlandish things, thousands of dollars worth of the massages was one of the most famous, that it really kept parents together, and teachers eventually had to settle.
Yeah, so in Ontario, the premier had actually threatened that if the elementary union didn't settle, and they were really refusing to do that, that she would cut wages for teachers in Ontario who were not performing their job, and they weren't performing their job. They weren't submitting report card comments. They weren't engaging in parent-teacher interviews, and these are all actually part of the legislated job description of teachers in Ontario. And an employer can impose whatever terms they want if there's no collective agreement in place, which there wasn't, and cutting wages is an example of that. The union then will have a recourse to escalate strike action, but really it's really uncommon for politicians to have the gumption to actually go through with cutting wages for these workers. So Wynne threatened to do that, whether she would have actually followed through on it, like in British Columbia. I'm really skeptical of that, given what Ontario's history and what this premier's history has been. I think it's more likely that was just kind of, something that the premier was saying for public consumption, just kind of, public consumption propaganda, to suggest that she would be tough on teachers when really she has no history of ever being tough on these teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to have that track record of credibility, which the BC government has through years of net zero and cooperative gains and other ways that they've done it. One last topic, Todd. You just came back from your debt clock tour. It's like the rite of passage for CTF directors, the debt clock tour. For those of you who've never seen the debt clock, it's a big truck followed by a horse trailer with a huge scoreboard that has a live real-time accounting of debt. How was the Saskatchewan debt clock tour, and any funny stories out of it, Todd?
It was an interesting tour, to be sure. I think the first response that we got from certainly the folks in government, but a lot of other folks was a surprise. Why is the debt clock here? How can it be here? Why is it in Saskatchewan? And partly because the debt clock simply hasn't been in Saskatchewan for many years. I also recently went duck hunting One of the things about duck hunting is you hunt the ducks where the ducks are. If you're going to go debt clocking, you take the debt clock where the debt is. The reality is Saskatchewan's debt is going back up. The government announced that it's going to borrow about $700 million this year for infrastructure. Subsequently announced it because they had some higher bills, obviously, on those forest fires, and oil prices went down. They were projecting a deficit of another $292 million. Now they say they're going to balance that part out, but it still leaves the $700 million. So people were really surprised. Why is the debt clock here? Again, because the debt's going up by about $2.7 million on average every day. So they were really surprised. But we did want to have that conversation now. Look, Saskatchewan's debt problems are nothing compared to a lot of other places. I also cover Manitoba. Manitoba has got a runaway deficit, debt well over $30 billion already. Their interest costs alone are $842 million every year. That's about $650 per Manitoban that just goes into interest. I mean, that's for a family of four. I mean, that's a mortgage payment or two that's just going into interest, and they see nothing, no way to fix that on the horizon. So in Saskatchewan, I don't want the debt clock to ever come back here. I'm hoping this is the last time it's going to be in Saskatchewan, but that's why we brought it out, because we want to send a message quickly and immediately and strongly that we want to see this stop, and we want to see the debt going back down in Saskatchewan. But one funny story, though, it was kind of funny. It was in Kindersley, Saskatchewan. So Kindersley's on the west side of the province. Massive agricultural area, massive oil area. Even with lower oil prices, unemployment there is almost unmeasurable. It's so small, below 1%. So I met a guy there. He's actually from Ontario, and he's like, "Hey, the debt clock." I'm like, "Hey, how's it going?" He's like, "Yeah, I'm from Windsor. I used to see this thing like, it felt like every couple of months the debt clock was rolling through in Ontario. What's it doing out here?" And so I had to give him a line. He was used to it, but he understood what the problem was. Once you start with that so-called temporary borrowing, which is what we started to see in Ontario after the Harris days, you get some temporary borrowing. We saw that 2009 in Manitoba, some temporary borrowing. What happens? Well, pretty soon your debt tends to go up quite a bit. I'm hoping Saskatchewan's different, but we'll bring the debt clock here, and hopefully we can cut it off now.
Yeah, the debt clock is great because first of all, it's probably the number one thing we do that the politicians loathe. I mean, politicians they're pissed off when they see the debt clock because it is this visual reminder of what their decisions, the consequences of their decisions. But the public, when they see it, they get it. I remember having it on the streets of downtown Kelowna one morning, and it was running, and these five or six old guys, in their kind of early 70s, they come by, self-described old guys, and they said, "Oh, Jordan, we're the Romeos. We're the retired old men eating out." That was the name of their group. And we're the Romeos, and we changed our breakfast morning to today so we could see your debt clock, because we think it's important. And we took pictures of them, and I think it ended up in the magazine and everything. The debt clock, when we did a BC debt clock tour in the heat of summer, and this was when the truck wasn't air conditioned, it was the worst. And at one point we were in Lumbee, which is in the Okanagan of BC, and the temperature inside the trailer was 50 degrees. And I almost blew up Penticton City Hall because I didn't realize the debt clock's powered by a generator. I did not realize the gas tank for the generator wasn't venting properly. So when I get to Penticton, I open it up, and this thing, usually it's the hard red plastic, is now almost round from pressure. And it could have been a CTF terrorist attack on the streets of Penticton. I very gingerly take it to the public park, and I'm like standing and opening the vent, and the spew of gasoline into the air. And oh man, it was not a good story.
Yeah, happily we now have air conditioning, so that's although it wasn't much of a problem because we had to do it in November this time due to the federal election. And yeah, we didn't have anything that exciting except for bad weather and rain pretty well throughout, which I suppose was very BC feel to it in some regards in that way. But yeah, it is shocking, even for me. I mean, look, you guys know we write about this stuff all the time. We write about millions and billions of dollars, and it's hard to imagine. But I actually took my dad on this trip, and it was kind of funny. At the start of the trip, our personal debt, because it breaks it down to, was $4,709. Dad was like, boy, I should pay for this now before it goes up. I'm like, yeah, if you could find a way to do that, I mean, let me know. By the end of the trip, it was, I think it was about, $4,715. Now, that's $6 or whatever. It doesn't sound like a lot. And if that's where it ended, it wouldn't be. But when we look at the books and the projections the government's putting forward, it looks to me, and the government hasn't denied it, that they're planning to borrow somewhere in the neighborhood of another $700 million next year. That's only going one direction, and especially with interest rates, they're low now, but that's not going to be permanent. I'm sure we've got folks watching who remember when interest rates were in the double digits. This is going to be a problem unless we get it moving in the other direction. And we can. We've seen it happen in Alberta when there was a concerted effort to pay down debt. It's possible. In Saskatchewan, even up until last year, we were building massive infrastructure projects without borrowing money. A few years earlier, they had paid down literally billions in debt. This is not some magical plan. It's never been done somewhere. Somebody asked me, well, pick an example of a government that's managed to invest in infrastructure, hold the line on taxes, and hold the line or pay down debt. And I'm like, Saskatchewan last year and the year before and the year before that. Look, this isn't rocket science. Look at the bottom line. Make sure the expenditures aren't higher than the revenues. You can't just wave a magic infrastructure wand and pretend that borrowing doesn't matter. It does. You have to pay it back. The guys buying the bonds on Wall Street and Bay Street don't care. They're going to want the money back regardless of what you spend it on. So let's stop borrowing. We can do this. It's just going to take some priorities.
Absolutely. Hey, Paige, we got to wrap up, but you've got a waste of the week story for us.
I do. Okay, so I'm going to reach back in time a little bit for this story, but I had to share it because it's our first episode and it's just so funny. So just a little background. The city of Calgary has a public art budget. When there is capital spending on infrastructure projects in the city, it's mandated that a portion of that go to public art, or that some of that money go towards public art. So it's 1% for a portion up to 50 million for the projects that are up to 50 million, and then 0.5% for the portion over 50 million. Basically, the project needs to cost $1 million, and it's capped at 4 million. So that's the policy. With that in mind, the City of Calgary's latest art project, I've been calling it a pretty poop palace. It'll make sense once I explain. So Calgary has, on a hill, sort of, beside the highway, a wastewater lift station. Essentially, sewage water, toilet water flows through it, goes to a different place. There are pipes underneath that have, different times. There's different amounts of sewage flowing through it. I wish I didn't even know this much about this, but there are different types. So what the City of Calgary has done is they commissioned an art project to be on the side of this wastewater lift station, this sewage pump station. And all it is a series of LED lights that look like pipes that flow, that are flowing. They're underground. They're visually represented on this. And what it does is the pipes will change color and light up at different capacities when more or less sewage is flowing through those pipes. This costs $236,000.
Oh,
so during an economic downturn, and to be fair, I'm sure the money was allocated before our economy went in the toilet, I guess.
Yeah, what color is that light?
Well, yeah, somebody said we should have a red light, at City Hall, and when they're not in the red, then we can turn it off. But basically, we spent $236,000 on this, almost $250,000, on a project during an economic downturn when taxpayers don't have the cash to spare to show how much poop essentially is flowing through the pipes at different times. So that gives you a little taste of what the City of Calgary spends its money on. And recently, I did give them the slight credit because we weren't during the downturn when this money was allocated. But I just recently saw I guess, an ad by a Calgary city councillor that was advertising an art project. They want an illuminated pathway, a sort of, with the ground being illuminated and pretty and artistic. And they're setting aside tens of thousands of dollars for that now. So now, during a time when, obviously you don't need to be a rocket scientist to know that here in Alberta we're going through some tough times. So they're still carrying forward with this ridiculous art budget. So perhaps we'll see more visual representations of sewage on the taxpayer dime soon.
Poop expert. Very true. Very true. The city of Victoria has announced $20,000 or so for singing handrails in stairways and parkades. Singing, yeah. So they'll light up and they will make music as you walk down the stairs because, Victoria is a city for tourists, and really we want them inside our parkade stairwells as much as possible, not enjoying the beautiful waterfront. Well, guys, that is it for the re-debut episode of Tax Talk from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Be sure to follow us all on Twitter. I'm at Jordan Bateman. Paige is at Paige McP with an MACP. Todd is at Todd A. McKay. Is that right, Todd?
That's great.
Awesome. Be sure to subscribe to our feed here on Blab. Give us props, all that good stuff. And if you're listening to this later on iTunes, please subscribe and give us a good rating for that as well. You can check out all of our work on taxpayer.com. Just so you know, Taxpayer or Tax Talk will return next week unless Paige and I have sobered up from this experience. Friday, November 27th, 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern, where our special guest will be Jody Emery. So Jody is a longtime activist for marijuana legalization. The Trudeau government has now promised to regulate, tax, and legalize marijuana, and we at the CTF are getting our heads around what that could look like. And what we can learn from Colorado and Washington, 2 states that have already done it. So who better to talk about that than Jody? We're looking forward to that. That's next Friday, 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern at taxpayer.com/taxtalk. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.